Gentlemen, welcome to the Refinery Safety Forum, and we will be talking about some what we think are very innovative and substantive tools that can be used by industry, by the community, by regulators, by any of the folks, the consultants, on how to address the issues of emissions from refineries. We'll also be talking about a new tool called the Regulated Site Portal. But before I do that, I'd like to recognize members of the Interagency Refinery Task Force. We have a number of folks here. We are City of Torrance has been gracious enough to allow us to use their facility. We've got Mayor Fury, Chief Cerna, Deputy Chief Dumais, and Chief Cerna will be giving some opening remarks in just a moment. We also have the California Air Resources Board, Catherine Dunwoody, Russ Bennett. We have South Coast Air Quality Management District, Dr. Jason Lowe. We've got the Governor's Office of Emergency Services with Deputy Chief Larry Collins. We've got Los Angeles County Health Hazmat and Fire Department with Chief Bill Jones. And we've got one of our other speakers, which is Dr. Karen Revelis with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. So what I'd like to do is, before we jump in, have Chief Cerna come in, just say a hello from the city, and we will jump into the meat of these things.
Good evening. I want to thank you guys for coming tonight. It's incredibly important that it's been a topic for our community, refinery safety, for several years now, and it's really important that it's actually very exciting that we have the CalEPA here, along with the other members of the Governor's Task Force here to look forward and work towards a safer refineries, not only in our city, but the entire state. So welcome to the City of Torrance, and if you need anything, there's Chief Dumais. He'll be more than happy to guide you along the way. So again, thank you and appreciate it, and look forward to a productive forum.
Thanks, Warren. Okay. So the way this evening is going to work, we will have a number of presentations. The first one will be on the Refinery Emergency Air Monitoring Assessment Report, and we'll have representatives of the Air Resources Board and South Coast AQMD. And then Dr. Revelis will be talking about the companion piece, which is basically about the health effects of chemical emissions from refineries. And then I'll be going into a portion on the Regulated Site Portal, right? And then we will open up to questions and answers. I recognize that this community is very interested in a product from two of the refineries. This is not about hydrogen fluoride or hydrofluoric acid, although I will mention a bit of that in the Regulated Site Portal. But South Coast is having a meeting this coming Saturday, which we'll talk about. There is a flyer over there. And I do want to recognize Greg Vlasic, who's the Assistant Secretary of Local Programs and Emergency Response at CalEPA, is my boss, who's down here. So I appreciate the good showing of the IRTF. And so with no further ado, I'll just do a quick little overview, and then we'll jump into the technical side. Again, these are tools we believe will be very useful for many members of the community, both the business and others. So, Interagency Refining Task Force, that little breach there caused that big black smoke coming out of the Chevron refinery in 2012. And what came out of that was improving public and worker safety at refineries. And we do have copies of this report here. It's also available on the website. It's also available in Spanish. I do have a little contact sheet that I can hand out for people that want to find some places where you can get these reports and others. Okay. And so what happened is we had the event at Chevron we had the 2015 event here at the former ExxonMobil facility. And the governor designated CalEPA to lead the Interagency Refinery Task Force. And we focus in on safety and prevention, emergency preparedness and response, and implementation, training, and enforcement. We both the Implementation and Enforcement Committee. And what we want to do is come out of it is better refinery safety by preventing accidents is the most important, and then to reduce the hazards and to have effective emergency preparedness and response when things might go awry. The work that's done in refineries is inherently hazardous, and it takes a lot of work in order to reduce that. A lot of the focus we'll be talking about here is on the air monitoring side. And this is just a quote from the refinery report, and just talks about how these are highly complex circumstances. They do, they take this crude and do a lot of amazing things, but it is inherently hazardous. And so we want to make sure that we have good maintenance, good training, effectively regulated. We want to make sure that the facilities are as safe as we can get them. Okay. They say that refineries, petroleum fuels will be part of my life and my children's life and probably my grandchildren's life. It's incumbent upon us to ensure that they are run as safely and effectively as possible. So we've had over 15 of these safety forums on very different topics. It was proposed regulations, other things like that. But we try to, again, demystify the issues, right? We also want to, as much as possible, depoliticize the discussion. Today we'll be talking about technical tools, right? And to provide exchange information among all the different parties. Break down, again, some of those institutional barriers that we encounter, and really have as much meaningful dialogue as we can. Again, tonight's focus is much more focused on the technical side of tools that can be used by all the different parties. So what do we want to do? We want that refinery safety, right? We want a culture that supports inherent safety. We want to make sure that all the different agencies, as you can see by those represented here, I think one of the best things that's happened on the Refinery Task Force is the cooperation and communication among the different players, okay? And if we can achieve the highest possible level of safety and prevention in the refinery sector in this state. So, with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Russ Bennett with laboratory monitoring.
Absolutely.
Very good. Have at it.
Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Russ Bennett, an air pollution specialist with California Air Resources Board's Incident Air Monitoring Section. Tonight I want to give you a short presentation on our Emergency Air Monitoring Assessment Report, because we want to devote most of our time tonight listening to your comments, concerns, and questions. Tonight we'll start with some background information on refinery incidents, share our assessment, share our findings and considerations, present our recommendations to improve air monitoring around refineries, and finish with next steps.
Hey Russ, you might need to move the microphone up more so he can hear you better in the back. There you go.
As a result of a fire at the Richmond Chevron refinery in August of 2012 and other mishaps in subsequent years, the government created an interagency refinery task force to address safety concerns at California refineries. As part of that task force, the California Air Resources Board and the California Air Pollution Control Officers Association created a project plan to improve air quality monitoring, modeling, and coordination around California's refineries. The project plan consists of 4 objectives, which are shown on the slide. To start off, we'll talk about the inventory of assets, protocols, and procedures that were accomplished during the first objective that was completed in May of 2015. Next, we'll talk about the second and current objective of the project plan. We will address safety concerns and monitoring around refineries. Lastly, we'll finish with objectives 3 and 4. Objective 3 is develop the guidance to implement the recommendations, while objective 4 is ongoing work to implement the guidance and to maintain the program that's developed. In a nutshell, the 2 issues can be summed up as data availability and coordination issues. Industrial incidents happen quickly. Therefore, obtaining timely air toxics information is critical. In-place air monitoring can help, but unfortunately, this type of monitoring varies throughout the state. Absent in-place air monitoring, responders must take samples or set up monitoring, but this can take time, especially to analyze collected samples. Modeling can help to predict the downwind concentrations of an accident, but unfortunately, it needs release information and meteorological data that can be difficult to obtain in short notice. Responders must focus their efforts on responding to the incident and have little time to wait for this information. Another issue arose during the 2012 August Chevron incident, and that's coordination issues. We found that industry, local responders, and public agencies need to do a better job of coordinating the response and disseminating information to the public. Messages should be based on accurate information, consistent among the agencies, and widely distributed as quickly as possible to the public. Also, industry, response agencies, and air districts should train and prepare for emergencies. As part of our second objective work, we identified capabilities, gaps, and enhancements and came up with 23 recommendations to address these issues. The first, when taken together, describe a layered air monitoring strategy that starts from within the refinery to the fence line and out in the surrounding community. The next set of recommendations recommend symposia to improve modeling and make them easier to use. The third set of recommendations are to develop ways that air districts, local responders, and industry can work together to prepare for emergency preparedness, response, and messaging. And lastly, we're envisioning CARB forming a refiner monitoring working group with air districts to implement the recommendations. Before we delve into our recommendations, let's take a minute to discuss routine and emergency air monitoring. Chemicals can harm us over a long period of time in small concentrations, or they can harm us in larger concentrations for a short period of time. Therefore, the systems that we're recommending need to be able to provide information on routine air monitoring as well as incidents with unplanned releases. To implement this, we're proposing dual systems that can provide the information for routine operations and also disseminate the information to the public in a format that they can understand. Our layered air monitoring strategy can be thought of as concentric circles of protection surrounding each refinery in layers. Since air pollutions travel with the wind, air monitoring conducted inside the refinery, at its fence line, and out of the community strike a balance between near instantaneous detection of leaks at their source to measuring actual concentration as the spill progresses. To start off to talk about our layered air monitoring strategy, let's talk about the monitoring that goes on inside the refinery. They do a wide variety of monitoring for safety and environmental purposes. For example, refinery workers wear badges that warn them of hazards, and they use handheld monitors for routine surveys, as well as planning unplanned releases. Also inside many refineries, there's air monitoring at the process units, and that warns the staff of hazards. For example, the Torrance and Chevron refineries have centralized control rooms that collect all the information and have like easier to maintain normal operations and respond to emergencies. We're finding that the information from these instruments can be transmitted to a central location and aid in emergency response. Therefore, we're recommending that refineries upgrade their instruments over time to transmit this location to incident command and include the use in training, preparation, and drills. The next layer of air monitoring occurs at or near the fence line. There are two ways to do fence line monitoring. One is open path monitoring, and the other is fixed array systems. Open path monitoring uses, for example, an ultraviolet beam of light to measure average concentrations passing this pathway, while point array systems measure the air at discrete locations. These fence line systems, in conjunction with meteorological information, can help to detect leak sources and also predict where the plumes will go. Data from these websites should be posted on a public website along with information on the status of the instruments. Moving out into the community, community monitoring actual measure the actual impacts in the community. We're recommending that community monitoring be located downwind in likely locations, and they should display their data to websites along with system status, meteorological information, and health values associated with the monitored substances. Also, air monitoring stations run by local, state and local air districts can provide valuable information during an incident. Therefore, we're recommending that air districts upgrade these stations or include their use in their monitoring plans. To supplement these fixed layers of instruments, local responders, health agencies, and air districts can deploy additional mobile and portable air monitoring equipment in response to conditions at the time. To promote technology to improve upon this layered air monitoring strategy, we are recommending that current work by air districts to evaluate emerging technologies be continued and supported on a statewide basis. For example, spectral flux technology can expand upon open path monitoring. Open path monitoring can only measure the concentration of chemicals crossing a narrow beam, while spectral flux technology has the capability to measure emissions crossing a plane downwind of emissions points. From above, monitoring from aircraft can detect emissions from all locations at a refinery. In addition, South Coast AQMD has established a lab to evaluate the sensors that the public is starting to purchase and use. This work is to ensure that these devices are accurate, consistent with agency monitoring, and are properly used. Modeling can be useful to predict downwind concentrations or to enhance air monitoring. We are recommending that industries use modeling beyond what is required in their emergency response or risk management plans and include their use in their emergency response plans. Modeling can be useful for training, drills, and exercises, while training should include the proper use of these models. Also, we're recommending symposia to determine the best models available, determine their suitability, and to evaluate the proper use. For example, the Oil Refinery uses a real-time modeling system in conjunction with real-time meteorological information that can determine downwind impacts within minutes of release. Also, to address cumulative and cascading mishaps, the symposia can include these effects in determining potential downwind concentrations. CARB interviewed local response agencies and managers from the major refineries in California, and these are the top 3 recommendations that we found to address their concerns. First, air districts should take an active role in working with industry and responders to plan for, train, and respond to refinery-related incidents. Next, CARB and the air district should establish an inventory of technologies and train responders on how to collect air information and distribute it to the public. Lastly, the unique operating status webpage by the Allen Refinery in Bakersfield was determined as a best practice worthy of statewide adoption. It continuously informs the public and surrounding local emergency responders of the operational status of the refinery, all the way from normal operations to the various levels of emergency at the refinery. We are currently working with CalEPA to conduct public outreach on the report's findings. We are interested in obtaining feedback, and we're looking to finalize the report in early to mid-2018. Moving forward, CARB and the air districts will work together on implementing the layered air monitoring strategy. It's important to note that we are not recommending a one-size-fits-all approach, but instead that there should be a tailored approach to each refinery in the state. We're also working with state and federal partners to make sure that regulatory revisions align with the report's recommendations. You can find our report along with the discussion of the findings and recommendations, along with some background information, a project plan, and a fact sheet summarizing the report's findings. You can use the link here or do an internet search on CARB Refinery. We'll be taking the questions and answers at the end of all of our presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ. So we have copies of the report out here, and we also have a little cheat sheet with local contacts and a lot of the agencies that are here in the reports, a little half sheet for you. To bring this from the state level down to the local level, South Coast as one of the partners in, as the air pollution control officers and a member of the Interagency Refining Task Force, has been active down here and doing some very innovative things. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Jason Lowe with South Coast to talk about what's going on here at the local level. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the good introduction. As Russ set the framework from the state level as far as describing the air monitoring layers, it's my duty in terms of showing how that is applied in the South Coast. So what I'm going to be reviewing is in the context of those air monitoring layers that Russ had just presented as part of the report and as part of the recommendations, how South Coast has moved on a lot of these air monitoring technologies and methods to move forward with some of the air monitoring efforts related to refinery work. So as an overview for the presentation, just to give a background of South Coast Air Quality Management District, give information relative to our incident response program, and that's how South Coast Air Quality Management District responds to any potential situation that requires immediate and emergency air monitoring. Also to kind of give that framework of the air monitoring layers, to talk about some of our existing air monitoring programs, which become the infrastructure for which a lot of the refinery monitoring would be based upon. And based upon this infrastructure, move into some more specialized programs which will be specific upon refinery air monitoring, which is AB 17 and Rule 1180, community air monitoring as part of that rule. And then lastly, just give a little bit of information that's not as much air monitoring related, but at least agency efforts relative to looking at refinery emissions. So just background for South Coast APMD, who are we? We are the regional agency responsible for the air quality. Mainly, we look at the stationary sources of pollution. Our sister agency, the California Air Resources Board, has primary jurisdiction over the mobile sources. We develop an air quality management plan in conjunction with the state who reviews it to reduce the air quality as needed for the criteria pollutants. We develop air quality rules and regulations that are part of our local jurisdiction of the 4 counties, and we issue permits for which all these stationary sources of pollution must abide by. We have a compliance unit which inspects all the facilities on a routine basis to make sure that they're in compliance with the rules and regulations as part of these development. We also develop and we fund a lot of clean air technology enhancements. So whether it be reducing diesel exhaust from boost movement trucks, to also looking at best available control technologies that can be used to reduce air toxics. AQMD funds a lot of those type of technology innovations and demonstrates them so they can come into the market. We also conduct air monitoring, which will be the large focus of tonight's topic. And then also our role is to engage with stakeholders, especially with the newer efforts and past efforts that we've been doing with our air toxics measurements. You may close to here, Paramount and Pumpkin, we've been doing air toxics measurements and hexavalent chromium. But also as part of these rulemaking efforts, we actively engage the community, get their input, so that way we can incorporate their considerations into the rulemaking. And part of that includes the public outreach and education that was mentioned by Russ. So specific to emergency preparedness, AQMD has an incident response program which is activated by essentially anybody by calling the number 1-800-CUT-SMALL. Many times we respond to a sister agency, whether it be first responding agencies such as the Torrance Fire Department or another agency that requires some sort of specific technical support. And by that support, we mean air monitoring. We do have equipment that can be deployed in the field, as well as equipment that can take samples and then brought back to our laboratory, which is located in Diamond Bar, for further chemical analysis. So we have a combination of field tools which can give near immediate information, as well as kind of more robust technologies, but they take a little bit longer for those final results. We also give air quality information as far as for anything large to the website. So all of our results will go on the website. Anything that we can have in near real time will also go to the website. So as part of the individual response, as Russ mentioned, we try to tailor it to the specific incidents. So once we can get that information online, then we can present it to the public for their review. One of the more recent examples was the Torrance ExxonMobil explosion, where we responded both to the initial explosion. We sent out units to help support any of the concerns. We basically took a map of where complaints were coming from, taking in information from the first responders to deploy chemists and also field technicians to look at near real-time air monitoring, as well as collecting samples that we can take back to laboratory for analysis. We also deployed for kind of a short term, meaning several weeks, air monitors near the refinery, protective of the community, so we can gather air quality information that was put online for review. And in the picture there, you can see that we've deployed 2 of these air monitors that were just outside the refinery. Plus, we had a mobile vehicle drained several times to look at concentrations of more gaseous pollutants that would be potentially emitted from the refinery. And this was due to the course of when they were also doing the restart of their unit, because at that moment there was potential for air pollution emissions. On top of that, we can take in information, as Russ mentioned, as part of the meteorology. So we do have a lot of meteorological measurements that we take along with these field measurements, along with some of the measurements that we have with our air monitoring station. Part of that infrastructure for the meteorology and also air quality monitoring in general, we have a network of 40 air monitoring stations that collect mostly criteria pollutants, which is like ozone, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, but some of them also measure air toxics. But this provides infrastructure for which we can compare a lot of measurements that we have when we do a response to see how elevated they are relative to what we'd expect in background air. As Russ had mentioned, and I won't go too much into detail, is our AQ SPEC program, where it evaluates and looks at these emerging sensors, which are low-cost technologies. Many people are starting to use them, and it provides a basis of good information for certain pollutants. For other pollutants, such as ones emitted by refineries, such as VOCs, the technology is not quite there, but a lot of manufacturers are pushing them to get better. What this program also does is it's starting to deploy sensors in different communities. It has received a grant from US EPA to work and engage and educate communities on the effectiveness of the sensors, how easy they are to deploy, and learn back from the community on lessons learned that they have for deploying the sensors, so we can create a better sensor network, both for community and also for the community. We also are currently in the 5th iteration of our multiple air toxics emission study. So before I showed you 40 air monitoring stations measuring mainly the criteria pollutants. This project looks at, for one component, it takes 10 of those air monitoring stations and does a full suite of air toxics. And what it does is it combines information with the emissions inventory, and it takes the air monitoring data from these 10 air monitoring stations over the course of a year, and it develops this air toxic map, which is located at the bottom corner, and it provides an estimate of the air toxics impact in certain areas. We are, like I said, in the 5th iteration right now, doing the monitoring from the start of this year until the beginning of 2019. And one component that is very relevant to this forum is that MATES also has an advanced technological component, and that's specifically for refinery air monitoring. And there's several different techniques with which I'll go over, which are going to be applied within the next year to basically add to an evaluation of toolbox methods that we can use for future air monitoring purposes. So one of the things that Russ had mentioned is kind of these aerial surveys, and what we do is basically we've hired out a firm, very advanced instrumentation. In fact, there's only 11 of these monitors in the world. So they're going to do a very advanced sweep of the entire basin to look at these hotspots for some of the air toxics. And of course, one of the main concerns that we're looking at would be the refineries. This would give us an idea. It's a snapshot. It's basically one flyover, and also looking at a bunch of historical data that they've done over the course of the past 10 years to give us an idea of perhaps where we can deploy our ground-based efforts. From there, we also have the flux sense fan, which is that remote sensing that Russ had talked about. And in there, we can combine mobile perimeter passes through this mobile platform to kind of get a profile. So if I can bring your attention down to here, where there's, where basically we will drive around a refinery using that wind information and using basically information of the levels of pollutants that are in that total column. We can see, like if the wind is blowing towards us, and you can see these elevated levels of pollutants, you get an idea that the source of those pollutants are located here. And that can help us identify and help the refinery identify or other facility where the potential source may be, so that they can go ahead and repair it if necessary. But this technology enables us to really pinpoint certain areas on the refinery that may just be out of maintenance or something, just give them information that they could potentially act on. We also plan on using that in the communities as well to do an assessment of community exposure, and again, to guideline the more stationary measures, because again, because this is mobile, it provides that snapshot. It's not a continuous at one point type of level. One thing that we're exploring is an optical tent concept. And what this does, it essentially uses similar open path technologies, but rather at the fence line, you essentially have something at an elevated point that looks down and rotates around. So basically you're getting a semi-continuous profile of pollutants going up. One of the things with the fence line, even though it's a good measure of what would be coming across the fence line, and that's important to know from the community perspective, sometimes too, some of the emissions will go a lot up higher, and then they can sometimes descend down. So this gives us a little bit more information relative to how much pollutant emissions would be coming from a particular facility. We also have the sensor networks. AQ-Spec has deployed over 200 sensors within the South Coast Basin. And as part of MATES 5, we are working together with a company called QSense, which has developed a VOC sensor that we're evaluating, and we're going to see its potential deploying these sensors around refineries, and also co-locating them, meaning putting methods that we know are more accurate next to them so we can do that evaluation. So just to kind of wrap it all together, there's several different technologies, but again, we're trying to form this toolbox that we can kind of guide our more permanent refinery monitoring efforts. So we saw kind of the stationary optical tent. If we can get that demonstrated, we're in discussion with a couple of refineries right now to see if we can get that technology demonstrated. Again, it would be of use to them because any future emissions that they may have is a loss of product. So they would gain the benefit of learning about a leak earlier than later. And then for us, of course, if it's identified earlier and fixed, then it improves our quality benefits in the surrounding communities. And then also we have the traditional air monitoring stations, which is deployed mostly for the techniques that you see from the laboratory, where samples are taken. Some of the samples are taken back to the laboratory for analysis. And the fence line monitoring, again, anything that's going across the fence line could be looked at with the fence line monitoring. Flight measurements to, again, kind of guide more of the ground-based efforts. And combo that with the mobile monitoring, again, if there's any things to correlate the fence line monitoring, and also it gives us a way to track back pollutants in real time. And then add on to that the sensor networks. So that becomes kind of a complete package. Again, not every, as Russ said, every situation is going to be slightly different. This allows us to, for MATES, demonstrate the capability of these different technologies and allows us to kind of give our best recommendations, even part of either a response strategy or monitoring strategy for refineries. So a lot of this information feeds into our more permanent efforts as part of Rule 1180, which was passed by our board. It's consistent also with the state's refinery rule. So the requirements are that fence line air monitoring systems must be deployed by the refineries. So they'll have an open path system, and a lot of them are talking about talking to contractors to get them installed, and they have to develop an air monitoring plan, which talks about their fence line coverage, what types of equipment, and what kind of assurances and quality data that would be under this plan to make sure that the data can remain up and then also provided to the public for review. And then also including a notification system for the communities. All these plans have to be reviewed by South Coast AT&D before they can move forward with implementing. Also, the refineries are paying a fee, which are being used for South Coast to deploy community air monitoring in the communities that are nearby the refineries. So in addition, we also will be implementing in the next year and a half community monitoring in various communities near refineries to follow up with the fence line monitoring. Another program is AB 617, which is also, we're working with the California Air Resources Board as part of the statewide air monitoring program. But the key function of this assembly bill is to reduce pollution at the community level. A lot of what we've learned for especially air toxics, it's very localized. Some of the pollutants that we measure at those 40 air monitoring stations I mentioned earlier, those pollutants kind of are longer lived and they travel farther, so they can be seen by air monitors far away. But when we look at air toxics, a lot of them are just very localized. So this assembly bill has helped the state and the local agencies, effectively reduce the emissions at the local level. So a component of that is air monitoring, for which a lot of these principles will be used at. So just some timelines for these programs. So right now, as I mentioned, MATES 5 is ongoing. This bill, AB 617, we're working with the state to basically deploy by next year. And Rule 1180 will be first deployed in 2020. Just some additional information relative to the supplemental environmental program that Russ briefly mentioned. So basically in 2015, the Torrance Refinery had an explosion, and there were settlements funds that were related to that, for which there was an open process getting input from the community to prioritize different projects and concerns for the city of Torrance. And the major things that were looked at were a community notification program and air monitoring. So those elements are being moved forward. Both elements are in kind of stages of development right now with the city. I think their progress right now is that they've at least gotten a contract for the notification, the sound notification, and I know that the refineries are meeting with some of the contractors with us to work on the air monitoring portion for the Torrance Refinery. And then I'm not a personal expert on the Rule 11 or 1410 with hydrogen fluoride, but as mentioned before, there is a workshop on the rule development. It's going to be the third one on this Saturday over in Torrance here. So they've done several workshop meetings, and this will be the third committee meeting to discuss potential measures for use and or mitigation of hydrogen fluoride. So the concept, though, is for mitigation and or phase out of the compound. So if you have interest and would like to speak and have your voice heard, that is the most appropriate forum for that. With that, I guess we'll take questions at the end. I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Dr. Lowe. So, you've heard that whereas, in some respects, feel like we're not doing enough, I can assure you that what we're doing here in terms of air monitoring and the movement is more than, to my knowledge, anywhere else in the world. The work from AB 617, 1647, the local rules here are really pushing the envelope in terms of capability and the technologies, as was indicated by the two previous speakers. So we learned here how to monitor, but the real next question is, what do you monitor for? And that is really the work that Dr. Reveles did with the health effects. Again, copies up here. And I'll let her talk about, which I think is a seminal document on linking health and activities within the refineries. Noting that while we're talking specifically about refineries, the efforts that are done here can have application to many other industries. So just please keep that in mind, especially when we get into the regulated site portal. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Karen Rebellis with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment.
Thank you, Paul. Hi, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for making it this far. So as Paul mentioned, there's two documents. One is what he called the cheat sheet, and it's just a two-pager, kind of a Q&A. It's on this table right here. It goes over the major points of the report, and it's going to be a reflection of what I present here this evening. Also has the link to the report online. This itself is the actual report, and it's pretty thick, but there's an executive summary that at the beginning which kind of goes over everything in brief. So I'm with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, OEHA for short, and we are a department within the California Environmental Protection Agency. And here's my email address. I have it at both the beginning and the end. So our mission is to protect public health and the environment through evaluating the risks of hazardous substances to human health. And in an emergency, we assist emergency responders and emergency managers in both local, state, and federal agencies to protect people's health from hazardous releases. So we assess health effects and characterize the exposure from these chemicals. This is the outline of my talk, but I think I'm just going to dive straight into the talk. We already had quite an intro about the timeline of how these things started. So ARB and CalEPA released their first refinery air monitoring report, and that's when they called upon OEHA and tasked us to create a report looking at these specific chemicals and their health effects. So that's just the very last one down here. So the Interagency Refinery Task Force, along with ARB and CalEPA, asked OEHA to write a report summarizing the health effects of chemicals coming out of refineries, with the idea that if you want to do air monitoring for chemicals being emitted from refineries, it's a good idea to understand what chemicals are coming out of the refineries first. So let's talk about a little bit about what this report does and doesn't do. It does provide a compendium of information on the chemicals that are emitted from refineries in California. It provides the regulatory health values and health effects associated with those chemicals. It also mentions the common process units and emission points at refineries in California. Both routine emissions and daily operations are reported, as well as accidental emissions and other non-routine emissions. All of the data that we collected is publicly available information. And we also looked at levels of toxicity as related to emissions. Then we finally selected potential candidates for air monitoring. This report doesn't actually measure exposure or risk from any specific refinery. The report is not, it is a companion report to ARB's air monitoring reports, and it does contain useful information about what chemicals could be monitored for and which chemicals have been emitted from facilities within California. So looking at the different types of monitoring their facilities that Russ discussed in his presentation. So knowing what's being emitted from refineries can help determine what chemicals we should monitor for as a way of reducing exposure. So as I mentioned, this was all publicly available information. So the first source of information was California Air Resources Board's webpage has a facility search tool where you can search by sector, in which case I searched for all refineries in California. I took the data in my first query, which was from 2009 to 2012, and I summed them across all refineries in California. So the data in the report is not for individual refineries, it's a sum total of the average annual routine emissions from all refineries in California. Second query was done towards the end of the report. It was about to be released, but some new data had become available. So we went ahead and queried that, and that was for 2014. And that actually landed up in the appendix of the report simply because it came so late in the drafting of the report. The second source of information was from the US EPA's. They have a information collection rule, and they collected information from refineries throughout the United States, but we only looked at the California refinery data. Again, we pooled it for all refineries across California. So the data represents an average of all refineries and what's emitted there. And the interesting thing about this data set is it included non-routine and routine emissions. So we were able to see a little bit more about what some of the non-routine emissions that were happening at refineries. But one limitation is the data was only for one single year, and that was for 2010. Also, we were able to get information on the process unit emissions, as Russ mentioned earlier. So we were able to see what some of the emission values coming off the different process units at these refineries within California, and we averaged those values across all refineries. Well, we didn't stop there because we wanted to make sure we didn't miss a single chemical that could be coming out of a refinery. So, as good scientists do, we did a literature search, and we looked for anybody that published on accidents associated with refineries or any additional monitoring that had been done by other groups. We also looked at internet databases, such as accident databases, and government reports and peer-reviewed journal articles, just to make sure we weren't missing any chemicals and that we had a thorough list. And within the report itself, it goes into more detail about how we did the searches so that you could go back and replicate the search yourself, and as well as the web pages themselves, links to those web pages. So now we have a list of chemicals. What do we do with that list? Well, we decided to see which ones of these chemicals do we already have health guidance values for. And so we started out by asking ourselves which ones had reference exposure levels. Reference exposure levels are levels at which you'd expect no adverse health effects in either an acute 8-hour or chronic exposure situation. These values are developed by OEHA and they're for non-cancer health effects. But we decided, why stop there? Why not also look and see, well, do any of them have carcinogenic potential? Are they on the list as being identified as carcinogenic or a reproductive or developmental toxicant, which is our Prop 65 list in California? Does the US EPA have a reference concentration, which is very similar to OEHA's RELs? So we created a table in the report for each chemical and listed which health reference values were available for that particular chemical. And then why stop there? We decided to also say, well, are there emergency exposure levels for each of these chemicals? So again, we went through the whole list and specified what those emergency exposure levels were. And the report also contains in-depth definitions of what each value is and what it means. So those values include the US EPA's acute exposure guidance levels, NIOSH's immediately dangerous to life and health, and the lower explosive limits. We thought that might be useful information as well. So what, again, this report is a compendium that lists all the chemicals and these corresponding values all in one place, which can be a quick and easy guide to refer to. We also were wondering, what are the specific health effects of these chemicals? So for a subset of the chemicals, we looked at, well, what are the acute and chronic health effects known about each chemical? There's a brief table in the body of the report, and then there's more extensive health summaries in an appendix of the report for the chemicals we chose. These do not represent full risk assessments of the chemicals, but we did provide links to those full risk assessments to where you can get more information than you'd want on each chemical. So what else did we look at? We wanted to say, well, how can we prioritize these chemicals for air monitoring, or how can individual air districts prioritize these chemicals for air monitoring? Well, there's a few things we thought they might want to know, like what the health effects are there regulatory health values established for them? Have they been involved in accidents before? Are they in common refinery processes? Do they have high routine and non-routine emissions? And so we did a data analysis. We kind of crunched through the data using all these different comparison points. And that data analysis is in one of the appendices of the report. And so if it checked off that box, we just went across and saw how many boxes does this check off across the board. So just to give you some of the numbers, 107 of the chemicals on the list had at least one health guidance value. 94 chemicals had at least one emergency exposure value, and 33 chemicals didn't have any health guidance value. These chemicals were generally released in much lower quantities than those that had guidance values. And I should just point out that we do develop guidance values for the most toxic chemicals. So if it doesn't have a guidance value, it may be an indication that it's relatively low toxicity chemical. So I already mentioned what was on the slide about the health effects. I just got ahead of myself. So I mentioned the process units. I'm not an engineer. I'll just start by saying that. There's probably a lot of people in this room that know a lot more about how refineries work than I do. I did have to educate myself a little bit for this project, although the focus mainly was on the chemicals and their health effects. So these are just some of the types of process units. And as I mentioned, we have data from US EPA that refineries self-reported to US EPA on what the emissions from some of these process units were. And so we took that into account in our analysis of the chemicals that appeared in the most process units, as well as the most common process units across all refineries in California. So again, we selected chemicals based on these criteria: the high routine and non-routine emissions, the low reference concentrations, RELs, RCs, if they were carcinogenic, low emergency exposure values, which both of these would indicate high toxicity. In the most processes, it has been reported to be involved in refinery incidences in the past, and also toxicity weighted emissions. So for this last one, I'm going to explain it in slightly more detail. So this table is a little bit overwhelming, but I'm just going to walk you through it. We've got a list of chemicals on your far left, and then a total pounds released as reported by CEDARS. Again, this is an average across all refineries in California for that chemical. And it's an average for the year 2014. This table does appear in the appendix of the report. And then toxicity weights, what are these? US EPA created toxicity weights for each chemical, and it's based on chronic adverse health outcomes. And for more information, I have the website down here in the corner. You can just look up US EPA toxicity weights, and it will give you more information about exactly what those are. But if you multiply the amounts released by the toxicity weights, the idea is that can give you this toxicity weighted in pounds released, and give you the idea of what's emitted in the most amount and what's the most toxic. Now, I also ran this analysis, though not shown, for the 2009 to 2012 data set, which was the original data set I used in the report. And the same chemicals rose to the top. The values weren't identical, but they were very close. So these top chemicals rose to the top with both data sets. I have not gone back and done the same analysis with the newly released 2015 data, but I don't think that we would find anything different. It's these chemicals that were rising to the top in terms of toxicity weighted emissions, which, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is only one criteria we used for our candidate chemical list. So this is the candidate chemical list, and this is just a recommendation. Air districts need to determine what's best for their specific district, for their specific refinery, and make those risk management decisions. This is just based on the data that we queried. And just as a follow-up to this list, there really weren't any surprises here for us in terms of these are already known toxic air contaminants. So this report identifies 188 chemicals that are emitted from California refineries. There's large variations in the frequency, in the amount, and in the toxicity of these chemicals. But there's generally good information for understanding the toxicity of the identified emitted compounds. All of the compounds with routine emissions greater than 10,000 pounds per year statewide, there were 14 of them, have an OECO reference exposure level. But we did not attempt to determine whether or how often these exposure levels may have been exceeded in areas near refineries. With respect to accidental releases, OE has identified additional chemicals emitted that are of particular concern. These chemicals have several health guidance values for them, as well as emergency exposure levels. They have low acute RELs, and that means they're acutely toxic at very low levels, and so they're indicative of high acute toxicity. They also are involved in multiple refinery processes, and that increases the chance of exposure if an accident happened at that particular process unit. They're also of interest for air monitoring because they all have high routine emissions of greater than 10,000 pounds per year. So California criteria air pollutants, although already routinely monitored for, there were some that rose to the surface as being particularly important when emitted from refineries. And hydrogen fluoride has been identified on the list. It is a highly toxic chemical of serious concern, although it is only used in 2 refineries in the state.
Yeah, that's kind of good. Well, we know.
So just some caveats of some chemicals that initially appeared on the list, but then didn't make the recommendation list. Hexavalent chromium, arsenic, and beryllium. They were all released in less than 100 pounds annually. That makes it very difficult to detect in air. I guess the point I'm making is that individual air districts, depending on the air monitoring strategy they're using, need to decide what they can measure based on the technology they're using. And if your emissions are too low, you won't be able to monitor for it. So the release of these chemicals across from refineries doesn't necessarily mean that local communities would face a significant health effect or significant health risk or substantial exposure. But it does increase the likelihood of exposure for nearby communities. Also, air monitoring of these chemicals may inform decisions that could reduce exposure. And the top candidates for air monitoring are not ranked or prioritized further. An important consideration for air monitoring is that emissions of individual chemicals will vary among refineries. So the air districts will need to look at the chemicals being emitted from their specific refineries and make decisions accordingly. That's all I have. I have a link here to the reports. And again, my email address. Feel free to email me with any additional questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Karen. You see, said this is going to be a technical session, and I wasn't lying, right? But this is where the real work gets done. This is where we really dive in. We want refineries to run safely and effectively. And we believe that these are tools that can help us do that. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the regulated site portal. There's a lot of data out there, but it is rare that we can bring it all together into something that's useful. And Greg's predecessor, Jim Bowen, when he was Assistant Secretary, put together the regulated site portal, which basically brings together data from several different data sources that can be used in a public-facing website so that information can be found and gathered. So what it is, it's a web-based viewer, and it can be used to identify any one of over 140,000 chemical facilities that handle or use hazardous materials or generate hazardous waste or somehow are in these systems. Within there, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, is basically a full explanation. So when you hit the About tab, it will give you a lot of more information than I'm going to cover here. So what we do is we have a series of 5 databases for much of the information that we work with here. The California Environmental Reporting System, known as CERS, gives us a lot of the data we use in the refinery activities. But all of these have their standing, and they have use in understanding these different programs. So EnviroStore is from the Department of Toxic Substances Control. State Water Resources Control Board has GeoTracker, right? You've got the California Integrated Water Quality System, and then you've got the Toxic Release Inventory. Now, I'm going to again go through this fairly quickly. You can look for a general search. In this case, it just says powder coating, and it brings up those facilities in which that is listed. And these magenta circles will show you each of those different locations. And as you zoom in, it will give you the opportunity to identify those individual facilities. And then you're looking at a facility profile. In this case, I use the Richmond Refinery. I have both the Richmond and Torrance Refinery in here. So it will give you information such as the address, where it's located, where it sits in the Enviro screen, which is work talking about impacted communities from pollution and other sources within California. And it's a very important work that we're doing at the state in terms of environmental justice and working with our partner organizations. So again, a general profile of the organization. Also, but note that over here, and it's hard to see in these small lettering, but there are a number of things that might come up as the Chevron Refinery. This is the one down here, but there are different nuances. So if you don't find what you're looking for initially, keep looking. That's one of the punchlines of my presentation here. Now, many times you want to know, what is the chemical storage? In this case, at the Chevron Refinery, they have listed 951 chemicals. Most organizations have less than 100 chemicals, and those will pop up. If there's more than 100 chemicals, you have to do a little more searching. Okay? So in this case, I put in butane. So we asked it to look for butane, and here is the name of the chemical and it's some different variants. Often we'll have what's called the Chemical Abstract Service number, right? You may find a hazard label, and then what is the average daily amount range? So again, I want to emphasize this is just a range, which may be, so it might be 601 gallons and up to 1,199 gallons. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are 1,199 gallons on site. Okay. So then, for some of the folks here might be interested in what is the compliance history. To my knowledge, it's the first time that this has all been put together with a public facing, so you can look at what is the history of what there were in terms of evaluations, violations, and other activities. so that you can see the history going back quite a number of years. Okay? And then we have, because there's a lot of data here, that you can tone it down into the regulatory programs, what sort of evaluation type, if you're looking for something specific, right? And what kind of enforcement. So again, you have the opportunity to narrow down what you're looking for. You can also export this to different things. So you can export it, the sites, the regulated programs, the affiliations, and there are, again, different tools. This is in much more detail in that About tab. Okay. And one of the nice things that you're looking at multiple regulatory programs. Again, to the best of our knowledge, these were all stored in different places, but now was able to be brought together in one spot. For example, you have, in this case, it's a high school in Belmont, California, but you actually have who's the parent corporation, who's the lead project manager on this, who's the local agency caseworker, so that you can identify who are the contact people. Again, we feel this is a very useful tool if you want to understand what's going on in your community and putting it in perspective. It also provides a link to those primary sources. Okay? So again, GeoTracker, EnviroStore. Okay? Now, for example, here's the toxic release inventory, and it gives you interesting information. In this case, excuse me, it is 20%, 26% of the releases on this toxic release inventory in Contra Costa County, and it's actually 30 out of 602 within the industry with nationwide. So again, I believe it's very useful information and if you want more information, you can go back to these sources. Okay? Now, people go, you're doing this as a public facing, might people with malice aforethought use this for, not nice things? So that's why the CalEPA worked very closely with these organizations to make sure that when we did try to give the public the maximum amount of information that they can use, because we believe in community right to know, but because of concerns for security, that we didn't want to overstep our bounds. And that's why on the front end they work with all these different organizations. So I don't have a live demo, so I'm going to take you on an example here. And I did use the Torrance Refinery. So, say, starting here at the beginning, right? And I can make this presentation available. Okay? So we want to find out which facility, because it could be listed as a former Exxon facility, a number of different things. So we're able to identify this as being the primary one. And here, similar to another, the other large refineries, they have up to 837 chemicals on site. Okay? It also gives you an aerial view. So for many folks, having that opportunity to look at things and visualize it that way is very helpful. Okay? So then say, what do you want to know? Again, because it has more than 100 chemicals, it's not going to list all of them, so you have to do some searching. So in this case, we looked and said, okay, hydrogen fluoride, but this is not the hydrogen fluoride that a number of people are concerned about. This is actually listed as aluminum fluoride and spent caustic, right? This is not hydrofluoric acid. So when I looked, I said, so sometimes you do have to do a little work. So I turned around and said, okay, I put in the keyword hydrofluoric, and this is the HF and modified HF that you'll see that is an item of concern in this community. So again, you can do this for any one of a number of chemicals. I know this is one of concern here, so I wanted to highlight this. Okay? And again, it shows the history of inspections. So many of these were done by the local participating agency, either Torrance Fire or the local CUP, or the Certified Unified Program Agency, represented by Chief Jones from LA County Fire Health Hazmat. So this is just a start. As they work on increasing this, and expanding it, we'll be adding a number of different things. For example, that might be of interest to folks on refineries is looking at the ocean inspection data, especially since the increased focus on refineries for on the part of worker safety. So again, here are some new tools that we're expecting to have in 2018, 2019. And again, improved search capabilities. I can tell you that right now, doing this on a mobile device will make you crazy. So I suggest you use a computer if you try to do searching on this. And then, again, here's additional data. I can say not for the refineries, but in one of my roles, if there is a release of a chemical in the state and I can identify what the facility is, I will immediately go to the regulated site portal and to dig in to get perspective and that situational awareness so that we can ensure that there is a safe and effective response. Okay? Greg, anything you want to add on the regulated site portal?
I would just add that the work you're describing here, these improvements are underway right now and expect to be done fall of this year.
Super. Okay. So again, this is an evolving process. Again, to the best of my knowledge, as many organizations are retrenching on availability of data, we felt that it's important in California for the community's right to know to maximize that, so people have an understanding of what's in their community and to help organizations to work as effectively as possible. So that's me, and what I'd like to do at this point is spend some time and take your questions. It is 7:15. We're a little actually ahead of time, and I'd like to open this up to anyone in the community, and I'll try to paraphrase anything for the folks. This will be on YouTube. This can be your 15 minutes of fame right now. I'm getting mine in 15-second increments. So I'd like to open up to the audience of any questions you might have. Yes?
Can I ask you a question about flaring?
Can, but that's not really the topic of this discussion.
Pollutants into the air.
Right.
Particulate matter.
That would often be found, for example, in the toxic release inventory. That would be found in there, and so the question is, having to do with flaring, do you have a specific question about that?
Yeah, I do. The city of Torrance has decided not to alert the community anymore when there's a flaring event. And I think that's very important that the community know, because if you're around the refinery, there are parks, and people are out exercising. They should not be out yet exercising when there's a flaring event. So is there anything that can be done to have the city start reporting that again on the Torrance alerts?
Well, I'm going to turn to the South Coast in a moment, and maybe Torrance Fire, but under the provisions of AB 1646, which we did not go into detail here, there is a requirement for notification to the community in the event of, specific, not of releases, and the criteria are to be established. So again, it was just past the end of last year. So I dare say you will see more requirements for notification of the community following a large flaring event. And it's interesting, in the rest of the country, flaring is used on a regular basis. In California, we use flaring as a safety mechanism, which to me, if you're flaring, it means that something's gone wrong inside, but the ability to address it is, it's better often to flare than to release the product itself. I don't want to go into much of the details. South Coast, anything you want to add on notification issues?
Sure. I mean, obviously, I can't comment on behalf of the city, so I'll probably defer to the city on commentary. But as far as what South Coast can do for larger flaring events, if it does cause pollution that reaches the ground level, again, that 1-800-CUT SMOG at least can alert us. That does send a response out. And if it's something that requires some air monitoring support, that's something that our unit would go out and help evaluate and provide information to the public, and would work with other counterparts at that point to try to give the information out to the community.
Chief Dume, anything you want to add on that?
No, we changed our policy based on re-looking at our response and our reporting criteria. We're using Torrance alerts to notify the community as a call to action. If we get notice from the AQMD because of the excess pollutants, we'll put that out to the community. But until that time, we won't use Torrance alerts for routine flaring operations.
Okay. Okay. Other questions? Okay. Let me start at the back and work our way through. Yes, please.
I noticed that there's really an absolute vacuum as it relates to seismicity of these areas, the vulnerability of any specific sites in San Pedro. We have a 25 million gallon LPG facility, storage facility, that's sitting on top of an earthquake fault in an earthquake rupture zone. Phillips 66, that entire refinery sits within that vulnerable, highly vulnerable earthquake rupture zone. And those tanks are, on both sides, are 40 plus years old, built to lower standards, and the standard of the potential of the earthquake fault in that area is over 7.3 magnitude. From what I understand, the tanks at Rancho were built to a 5.5 to 6.0 standard. It's all liquefaction, landslide area. And so we're talking about retrofitting two-story apartment buildings in order to make them safe. Meanwhile, these folks are sitting next to facilities with 3-mile blast radius that have tanks built to the substandard and are likely to be impacting the entire region. So why are you not relating anything or touching on the subject of seismic vulnerabilities?
Risk generally.
Yeah. So if I might, tonight's session is on air monitoring and health effects of emissions in the regulated site portal. As part of the other activities that are going on is the emergency preparedness and response regulations, which, among other things, you look at all the risks and the potential for releases of the refineries, not the Rancho LPG facility. Right.
Phillips is a refinery, and they're in that same rupture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, tonight's presentation is not on seismicity. I'd be happy to talk about that at great length in another forum, but tonight we're focusing on this.
What I'm looking at here is a report that says improving public and worker safety at oil refineries.
Yes.
And obviously, encompassed in that title is not specifically talking about air emissions. On the face of it, anyway, it's talking about public safety.
You're absolutely correct. And tonight's session is focusing on air, and we can have additional sessions on seismicity and other hazards that will impact it, both internal and external forces. Again, I'd be happy to talk about that, but tonight we're focusing on this presentation. I'm not trying to push you off, but that is, again, that is the topic of another discussion. And I dare say when we move forward and we move into the formal rulemaking process on the emergency preparedness and response regulations, your concerns and comments will be much more timely on that point.
Is there a document anywhere that references that now? Has there ever been a meeting conducted that references the seismic issues?
I dare say other organizations such as the Seismic Safety Commission and other things like that, but we've not specifically sat down and addressed that specific issue. We talked about other issues related to seismicity, and I assure you that that is of concern because clearly we're in California and this is a highly seismic area. Let me move the question here on. Yes.
I guess, how far are we from having actionable information? Because I guess the two things I would want are timely information, right? I do triathlon, so I'll go out and bike 30, 40 miles, or I'll run 7, 10 miles. It'd be helpful for me to know when there might be a higher risk associated with doing that, since I live about 1.5 miles from the refinery.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like we still don't have any idea, or we don't have any indication of how much more risk there might be with doing it in different locations, even in the South Bay. We don't have any idea when, we don't even report what times that might be more risk. And I guess the other thing is, when do we have accurate information on the long-term effects? Like, I grew up in a different part of the country. Maybe we don't have as advanced air monitoring there, but we don't have refineries a mile and a half from homes. And I want to know what are the long-term effects of that for the people living here compared to the folks living back where I grew up who don't have some of that type of thing here.
Well, you had a couple questions, and I'm going to paraphrase it. So the question is, when and where will there be actionable information for both events that are going on now, and then how about the long-term effects of these? So, and I'll turn to the folks at the air districts. Just passed at the end of last year were two bills that I think are of note, which is AB 1646, having to do with notification, and the other is 1647, which has to do with air monitoring. And as Russ indicated, there are a number of refineries, three, as I remember, Alon in Kern County, Chevron in Contra Costa, and Phillips 66 also in Contra Costa, that have real-time monitoring, community monitoring available on a continual basis. I would dare say that you'll see a lot of that expanded to the other refineries around the state, and again, there are some other monitoring rules locally. And Dr. Lowe, anything you want to comment?
Sure. So as I mentioned in the presentation, the 5th iteration of MATES is ongoing right now, that advanced monitoring component. Part of that demonstration portion will be in the Carson-Wilmington area for that sensor deployment, along with some of those initial stages of putting our more traditional methods next to those sensors. That will lead into the 1647, or for us, it's the Rule 1180, which is the community air monitoring for all the refineries within our basin, which is scheduled to start. We have a deadline of January 1st, 2020. So the information that we're learning off of these demonstration projects will go into that permanent air monitoring, and that is permanent from 2020 until perpetuity as far as the rules currently stated. That will be the long-term assessment, but for pollutants that can be provided with near real-time information, they will be provided that near real-time information. Unfortunately, some of those pollutants, as presented by Reha, a lot of them are very chemically hard to do in real time, and they will require the laboratory analysis collected by samples. But we are looking at the long term. A lot of it's long term. So to do the assessments, it's you don't necessarily need that instantaneously to affect your decision. But as far as the information that we've gathered, we can then do more health risk assessments to determine that, and then do the kind of root cause analysis from there.
And just Chief Dumais, your Torrance alert is an all-hazard notification system?
That's correct.
And it can be sent out to mobile devices?
That's correct.
Okay.
Emails, text messages.
So if you have not done so, I would recommend that you sign up for Torrance alert, so if something's happening and you're out and about in the community, hopefully it'll get to you.
I am signed up for Torrance alerts,
Okay.
but it doesn't notify me this type of stuff, right?
Right. Okay, so I'm going to work our way down.
I just wanted to comment that there will be a air monitoring system going in at the end of this year, early next year, that was from supplemental environmental project funds from the AQMD, from Sonoma Tech, so you can sign up there.
Okay, so there is an additional system that's going to, and the information will be public facing?
Yes, it'll be real time, people get on their mobile phones and they can be alerted to flaring events or a bump in chemicals and things like that. So less stringent than Torrance alerts as far as notification.
And then Sally, and then we'll work our way down over here.
So I have a question and a couple of requests related to OEHA. A briefing, I'd like to direct the question at you. I talked to Dr. Velez about this, but it seems like there isn't a very good method to ensure accurate reports on releases.
So there seems to be a general lack of specification of standards, methods to be used to estimate, confirmation of the estimates that are given, that sort of thing. And you've got a couple of tables in her report that just are really out of line with what I've seen in the reports that I've been looking at, like the toxic risk inventory, like 3,460,000 pounds per year release, what I usually see like an average of 140. So I'm wondering is your effort going to address that issue at all about how to make sure that those reports are more accurate?
We're always doing that. And for example, the toxic release inventory doesn't necessarily mean it's released to the environment. Right? The TRI means it's gone off-site anywhere. It may be going to a treatment store and disposal facility. So the numbers that you maybe...
Can I ask a question about
Sure.
that? Is that always for disposal? That wouldn't include things that are taken off-site to get regenerated, does it? Or does that also include?
Is that for recycling? I forget.
Well, regenerated,
Yeah.
it's not being disposed of, it's,
I'm not positive on that, but when you see like massive numbers, sometimes it means that it's being sent elsewhere. It's not being sent out into the environment. So,
non-disposed,
right.
whatever the category is, which is, I looked and looked, tried to figure out what that meant. I mean, I couldn't imagine like hydrofluoric acid being sent to a toxic waste dump, but there's certain things I can imagine. But okay, so that was my question. I do have a couple of, where's the doctor? Oh, is she still?
She's here.
Oh, there you go. So I just had a request about, let's see, you mentioned that you have the acute and then you've got the chronic effects for different chemicals. I just looked at the one for HF and I know that you do have a link to a more full description. But you might want to revisit the acute because the acute, for example, people die all the time in labs and whatever from exposure to HF. One of the main causes of death is arrhythmia and effects on the heart because HF binds with calcium and it damages the internal organs. So that's not mentioned. So I feel that it should be under acute because the things that result in death seemed like they weren't listed.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate your comment that we did not make this a complete compendium of all health effects for each chemical. At our webpage, we have full risk assessments for each chemical. US EPA also has full risk assessments for each chemical. This wasn't an attempt to replicate those risk assessments. It was merely an attempt to say what the basis of our acute reference exposure level was. So we don't actually look at every single health effect when we develop an acute reference exposure level, because an acute reference exposure level is a level at which we expect to see no adverse health effects, even in susceptible subpopulations. So we look for the most sensitive health effect in the most sensitive species. And if we can protect against that, we can protect against anything more severe than that. So it's a slightly different approach in the health effects we're looking at for reference exposure levels, as opposed to looking at the umbrella of all health effects for a specific chemical. In other words, we're looking for just the opposite of what you said, the most sensitive health effect, not the most severe health effect. And so, again, I provided plenty of references to full summaries of all health effects at both federal and state level reports. So again, that was never the purpose of this report, to be a location where you could find a complete list of health effects.
Okay, I have one more question about that. You mentioned that one of your responsibilities was to evaluate the risk posed by the different chemicals and tasked to look at specific chemicals. So I have an OEHA report from a few years ago on HF toxicity, and it was very clear. It clearly stated that the office believed, the people that did the research, that HF toxicity was misunderstood and mischaracterized in the ERTG, and in particular categories, the ones that EPA uses for the risk management program. program, and that the toxicity was actually significantly greater. So that was a little disturbing, and I tried to find out if the office followed through and looked at that. I think if you're going to be looking at chemicals that might be emitted accidentally from refineries, maybe you should revisit that. I could send you, I don't know how easy it is for you, if I could send you the report that I found.
Okay, I was not the author of that particular chemical-specific risk assessment. I'm assuming you're referring to the reference exposure level for HF, is that correct?
Well, it was, the reference, ERPG,
Yeah.
but it was an observation by your office.
Right, so we develop reference exposure levels, not ERPGs. We don't base our reference exposure levels on federal government values. So we don't base them on AEGLs, ERPGs, or even RFCs. We do our own research. We look for the most sensitive study, looking at the most sensitive health endpoints. So it's perhaps was mentioned in that report that the ERPG level, that we didn't agree with the key study they chose to use. I'm not familiar with that, but the ERPGs have very different